Two journalists just got arrested for covering a protest, not detained at the scene, arrested weeks later by federal agents at the personal direction of the Attorney General. Don Lemon, former CNN anchor, and Georgia Fort, independent Minnesota journalist, face up to 10 years in prison for filming protesters disrupting a church service. The White House mocked Lemon's arrest with "When life gives you lemons" and chain emojis. Press freedom groups are calling this an unprecedented assault on journalism. The Trump administration says they participated in a coordinated attack on religious freedom. Today, Sophia and Liam battle. Is this journalism being criminalized or criminals hiding behind press credentials? And we need your take, because this isn't theoretical. Either journalists can cover protests without fear of federal prosecution, or covering the wrong protest becomes a crime. Which side are you on? Here's what happened. On January 18th, protesters stormed City's Church in St. Paul, Minnesota during Sunday service. They chanted "ICE out" and "Justice for Renee Good," disrupting worship. The target? Pastor David Easterwood, who also directs ICE enforcement operations in Minnesota. Don Lemon and Georgia Fort live-streamed the entire event, interviewing both protesters and congregants. Lemon repeatedly said on camera, "We're not part of the activists, we're just reporting on them." But here's the shocking part. 2 weeks later, federal agents arrested Lemon at a Beverly Hills hotel while he covered the Grammy Awards. Over 24 agents for one journalist. Georgia Fort was arrested at her home in Minnesota. Attorney General Pam Bondi personally directed the arrests, posting "at my direction" on social media. They're charged under an 1871 anti-KKK law and the FACE Act, federal laws designed to protect churches and clinics from violent attacks. Maximum sentence? 10 years in prison. The twist that changes everything: 2 separate federal judges rejected arrest warrants for Lemon and Fort, finding no probable cause they committed crimes. One judge, a George W. Bush appointee, wrote there was no evidence of criminal behavior. The Justice Department got a grand jury indictment anyway. So is this journalism or conspiracy?
This is the government criminalizing journalism. It's terrifying, it's unconstitutional, and it's exactly what authoritarian regimes do to silence critics. Don Lemon and Georgia Fort were doing their jobs, documenting a newsworthy protest. ICE had just killed 2 U.S. citizens in Minnesota. Protesters targeted a church because its pastor runs ICE operations. That's news. Journalists covering that story aren't co-conspirators, they're performing a constitutional function. And the evidence proves this is political persecution. 2 federal judges said there's no probable cause to arrest these journalists. One judge explicitly found no evidence of criminal behavior. But the Trump administration shopped around until they got a grand jury to indict anyway. That's not justice. That's forum shopping to target journalists. The White House literally mocked Lemon's arrest with "When life gives you lemons" and chain emojis. That tells you everything about the motivation here. This isn't about protecting churches. It's about silencing a Trump critic who's been covering ICE abuses in Minnesota. They're making an example of him to scare other journalists. Cover protests we don't like, face federal prosecution.
Sophia wants you to ignore that these journalists helped plan an attack on a church during worship. That's not journalism, that's participation. Here are the facts. Lemon and Fort attended the organizational meeting where this protest was planned. They knew the target in advance. They agreed not to reveal the location beforehand. That's complicity, not documentation. They live-streamed protesters storming a church, disrupting a religious service, terrifying congregants, and they framed it sympathetically as legitimate protest. The FACE Act protects both abortion clinics and houses of worship from interference. Protesters violated congregants' constitutional right to religious freedom. If you help plan that violation and then document it while presenting it as justified, you're not a neutral observer, you're an accomplice. And Sophia's 2 judges rejected it argument is misleading. A federal grand jury, ordinary citizens reviewing evidence, found probable cause to indict. That's how our system works. Prosecutors presented evidence. Grand jurors believed crimes occurred. That's legitimate. Being a journalist doesn't give you immunity from conspiracy laws. If you help organize criminal activity and then film it, calling yourself a documentarian doesn't protect you.
They didn't help plan it. They covered an organizational meeting because that's reporting. You're criminalizing newsgathering.
They agreed to keep the location secret. That's not reporting, that's operational security for an attack on a church.
Journalists protect sources and embargo information all the time. That's standard practice, not conspiracy.
When you embargo information about a planned crime to help it succeed, that's complicity. They prioritize protesters' goals over congregants' rights.
So, we've got journalists in federal custody, both sides accusing the other of destroying constitutional rights, and nobody agreeing on what journalism means. But here's what neither side is addressing. This case will define whether covering protests is protected or prosecutable. Before we explore that precedent, I need to know where you stand. SOPHIA, blue symbol. This is press freedom under attack, political persecution. Liam, red symbol. This is criminal conspiracy, not journalism. Your vote determines whether we protect journalism or prosecute participation. Now, let's examine what's really at stake.
Let me explain why this prosecution is an existential threat to journalism, not hyperbole, actual threat. First, the conspiracy charge is based entirely on news-gathering activities. Attending planning meetings, that's how journalists learn about upcoming news events. Agreeing to embargo locations, standard practice to maintain source trust and access. Live streaming the protest, literally journalism. Every single thing they're charged with is normal reporting. Second, the FACE Act has never been used against journalists. It's designed to prosecute people who bomb abortion clinics or physically block church access. Using it against people documenting protests is unprecedented legal theory. If this stands, every journalist covering a protest on private property faces federal prosecution. Third, the political motivation is undeniable. Lemon has been covering ICE abuses extensively. He's interviewed families of people killed by ICE, documented the Minneapolis crackdown, criticized the administration. Then protesters target a church where an ICE official is pastor, Lemon covers it, and suddenly he's arrested weeks later. The timing isn't coincidence. The precedent this sets is catastrophic. Journalists can be charged as co-conspirators in any protest they cover if prosecutors claim their presence aided the protest.
Sophia's defending people who helped terrorize churchgoers during worship. Let me explain why this isn't protected journalism. The indictment doesn't charge them for covering anything. It charges them with conspiracy to violate civil rights, specifically congregants' right to worship without interference. The evidence? They participated in planning the disruption, agreed to operational security measures to ensure its success, and documented it while framing the criminals as heroes. Real journalism is neutral observation. What Lemon did was advocacy. Watch his livestream. He's sympathetic to protesters, hostile to congregants who complained, framing church disruption as justified resistance. That's not documenting news, that's producing propaganda for a criminal act you helped plan. And the FACE Act never used against journalists argument? It's never needed to be, because journalists don't usually help plan attacks on churches. This is a novel situation, people calling themselves journalists while functionally operating as protest organizers. The grand jury saw evidence we don't have. 23 citizens reviewed it and found probable cause for every charge. Maybe that evidence shows communications proving they weren't observers but participants. We'll see a trial, but prosecuting people who conspire to violate other civil rights isn't authoritarianism, it's law enforcement.
Propaganda? He interviewed both sides. He spoke to congregants and protesters. That's balanced journalism, not advocacy.
He attended secret planning meetings and agreed to help protesters. You don't do that if you're neutral. You're describing what he did after helping organize it.
And there's the impossible question. Where's the line between covering protests and participating in them? Can journalists attend planning meetings without becoming conspirators? But here's that uncomfortable truth. This case reveals government power to redefine journalism as conspiracy whenever convenient. The FACE Act language is broad. Anyone who intimidates or interferes with religious freedom can be prosecuted. If a journalist's camera presence at a protest aids its impact, prosecutors can claim interference. That's terrifyingly subjective. But the other uncomfortable truth, journalists increasingly abandon neutrality for advocacy. Lemon wasn't covering an unexpected event, he knew about it in advance, attended planning meetings, agreed to embargo details, and framed it sympathetically. Traditional journalism ethics would question all of that. He crossed lines that used to separate reporters from activists. So we're stuck between two dangers. If we don't prosecute journalists who genuinely conspire in crimes, we create immunity for illegal activity as long as you hold a camera. If we do prosecute journalists for aggressive newsgathering, we chill all protest coverage because reporters fear any contact with organizers becomes conspiracy. The real problem? We don't have clear standards anymore for what journalism is. When anyone with a phone can call themselves a journalist, when advocacy and reporting blend together, when sources become collaborators, the legal system doesn't know how to handle it. Neither do we. Both sides invoke the Constitution. Press freedom is in the First Amendment. Religious freedom is too. When protesters violate religious freedom and journalists document it, which constitutional right wins? The courts will decide, but whatever they decide sets precedent for decades. And this connects directly to institutional independence. While journalists face prosecution for covering protests, the Supreme Court decides whether Trump can fire the Federal Reserve Chair, whether independent institutions resist political pressure or bow to it. If journalists can be prosecuted for coverage that angers the administration and Fed chairs can be fired for policies the president dislikes, what independence remains? When courts become arbiters of which journalism is real and which is conspiracy, and which Fed policy is acceptable versus fireable, institutions lose autonomy. The Don Lemon case isn't just about two journalists, it's about whether institutions, press, courts, central banks, can function independently or become subject to political control. That Federal Reserve case determines if expertise and independence matter, or if loyalty to political leaders trumps everything. Watch it next to understand how institutional independence protects, or fails to protect, democracy itself.